All right, welcome back to the deep dive. We are so excited to jump into another one of your sources today.
Yeah, this one looks really interesting.
Yeah. So this one comes from a listener who's particularly interested in, I guess you say, self-development and personal growth. And they sent in this chapter called Moses Saved by the Angel, Self-Parenting. Yeah, right. Catchy title.
Yeah, I like it.
So we are going to really deep dive into this chapter today.
That sounds good.
And I think this is going to be a really valuable deep dive for anyone who, listening, who's interested in understanding themselves better, maybe fostering some more inner support, just understanding how they can be more for themselves, essentially.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the mission here today, to explore this whole concept of self-parenting. And specifically, we're going to look at a few key things that the author brings up. One is, starting with understanding yourself with compassion, which I think is so important.
Hmm.
We're also going to look at accepting all of our feelings, not just the good ones, but also the tough ones, like guilt and anxiety, why it's so crucial to, not beat ourselves up about the past, be kind to ourselves about our journey.
Self-compassion.
Exactly. And then finally, we're going to touch upon how things like therapy and counseling can really guide us in this whole process.
Okay, so it seems like, if someone is kind of on that path of personal growth and development, this is a great deep dive for them.
Absolutely, yeah. So let's dive right in. The author starts off right away by saying that the very first thing that we can offer ourselves in this whole self-parenting thing is self-understanding.
Wow.
And, giving ourselves that psychological support,
Hmm.
which makes sense, when you think about how parents kind of interact with their children. When you have a child, understanding that child's needs, their motivations, kind of all the stuff that's going on, it naturally leads to these supportive actions.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It's that fundamental connection that I think a loving parent has, right? Like that curiosity and that care. And so it sounds like the author is suggesting that we need to kind of turn that inward and bring that same compassionate curiosity to ourselves.
Exactly, yeah. Instead of judging ourselves, it's
Right.
more about being open and curious and really trying to understand who we are, beneath the surface.
Hmm.
And what's interesting is the author makes this distinction between this deep self-understanding
Great.
and just like trying to be positive all the time.
Oh, interesting.
It's not about, forcing optimism, but more about gradually letting go of some of these defenses that we've built up over time,
Okay.
which, often are in response to past experiences, anxieties, things like that.
So these defenses, could you talk about that a little more? Like, what are some examples of these defenses?
Yeah. So it can be a lot of different things. I mean, I think a lot of times these defenses become so ingrained that we don't even realize they're there.
Right. Right.
But they can show up in how we react to certain situations.
Mhm.
Maybe we always get defensive when someone criticizes us, even if it's constructive criticism.
Okay.
Or maybe we tend to withdraw from relationships when things start to get a little bit too close. It could also be, those negative self-talk patterns that kind of just run on autopilot in the background.
Right. Yeah, like that inner critic. So it's stuff that we've kind of developed to protect ourselves, but ultimately it's holding us back.
Exactly, yeah. It served a purpose at some point, but now it might be preventing us from growing and connecting and really living authentically.
Yeah. Yeah, makes sense. So then how do we actually, start to develop this self-understanding? Like, what are the practical steps involved?
Yeah, so the author points to this skill of self-awareness as being, really key here.
Okay.
And it's about, really tuning into our inner world. It's noticing things like, those critical thoughts that we were just talking about.
Right.
Identifying what triggers our anxiety, noticing when our actions are kind of working against what we really want long term.
Okay. So just kind of becoming more aware of all those things that are happening internally, the thoughts, the feelings, the reaction.
Right, exactly. And it's not just about noticing, but then asking ourselves, well, what's the meaning behind this?
Oh, interesting.
Like a parent would, with their child. If a child's acting out in a certain way,
Yeah.
a good parent's can ask, well, what's going on? What are you feeling? What are you trying to tell me?
Mm-hmm.
And we can do the same thing with ourselves.
Yeah. Instead of just jumping to the self-criticism, right? Like, why did I do that? I'm so stupid, or whatever it is.
Yeah.
It's more about taking a step back and saying, Okay, well, what feelings are driving it? What needs am I maybe trying to meet?
Yeah, and the author gives this great example. Someone who always thinks, I'm my own worst enemy.
Yeah, I know a few people like that.
Right. We all do.
Yeah.
Instead of just accepting that as like a fact, the author suggests, approaching it with curiosity, asking yourself, well, I'd really like to understand why I feel so much anxiety about disappointing others.
Oh, that's such a great reframe
Yeah.
because it moves us away from, blaming ourselves
Right.
to actually trying to understand ourselves.
Exactly.
And,
Yeah.
and it kind of shifts the energy a bit too.
Totally. And then the author makes this other really crucial point,
Okay.
which is that those negative attitudes and behaviors that we have, a lot of times they served a purpose at some point.
Okay.
They were ways we learned to cope with difficult situations.
Oh, interesting.
And understanding those origins can actually help us to let go of them
Oh, okay.
when they're no longer serving us.
Oh, that's really interesting. So it's like acknowledging that maybe a certain behavior like was once a really useful tool, right? Like it
Yeah.
helped us survive or navigate a difficult time.
Right.
But now it's not so useful anymore. It's just getting in the way.
Exactly.
Right?
It's no longer serving its original purpose. And then on top of that, the author really emphasizes that it matters what tone we're taking when we ask ourselves these questions.
Oh, okay.
Are we being kind of harsh and accusatory like we're on trial?
Right?
Or are we approaching ourselves with that gentle curiosity of someone who really wants to understand and help?
So it's the difference between like an internal interrogation
Totally.
and a helpful conversation,
Exactly.
like we would have with a friend or a loved one.
Exactly, yeah.
And that takes time, right? I mean, I think so often we want these quick fixes, right?
Yes.
We want to just change overnight, but the author actually addresses that, right?
Yeah. They do. They do. And actually, a lot of times I'll ask clients this question. How long do you think it took you to develop these challenges,
Right.
to get to where you are now?
Hmm.
And when people think about it, it's often years, sometimes decades,
Yeah.
you know?
That we've been carrying this stuff around.
Exactly. And so it's a good reminder that significant change, real lasting change, it also takes time.
Mhm.
We have to be patient with ourselves.
Yeah. You can't rush the process of growth and healing.
Exactly.
So we've talked about, self-understanding. What about this idea of self-acceptance?
Yes, so self-acceptance.
Mhm.
This is the next big piece. And the author's really clear that, this doesn't mean that we suddenly think we're perfect or
Right.
that we love everything about ourselves all the time.
Yeah, I was going to say that's not realistic, right?
Right.
To,
Yeah.
to just like love everything about ourselves all the time.
Exactly. But instead it's about learning to tolerate the full spectrum of our emotions, all of
Nice.
it.
Yeah.
The joy, the sadness, the confidence, the fear.
The messy stuff.
Yes, the messy stuff. Even the really uncomfortable ones like guilt and shame.
Yeah. Yeah, those are tough ones
Right.
to accept and deal with.
And what the author points out, which I think is so fascinating, is that how we relate to our own feelings often mirrors how the adults in our early lives responded to us.
Oh, wow.
So if only certain emotions were acceptable growing up,
Hmm.
we may have learned to kind of suppress or judge those other parts of ourselves.
Yeah. So we're kind of internalizing those messages
Totally.
and carrying them with us into adulthood.
Exactly, yeah. And guilt is a particularly tricky one that the author brings up.
Okay.
Especially for people who identify with having ADD. There's often this really strong tendency to be people pleasers,
Hmm.
and this can lead to this really deep-seated guilt when they prioritize their own needs or when they feel like they've let someone down.
Yeah, it's like that fear of disappointing others or being perceived as selfish.
Exactly.
That can really hold people back.
Totally. And to really illustrate this complex role of guilt, the author shares this really fascinating ancient Jewish legend about baby Moses.
Oh, wow. Tell me about it. I'm intrigued.
Yeah, so the legend goes that there were these soothsayers, and they predicted that baby Moses was going to, be a challenge to the Pharaoh.
Okay.
So to kind of test this, they placed an onyx stone, which symbolized power, and a hot coal in front of him.
Oh, wow.
And if he reached for the stone, it would be seen as the sign of ambition, and he'd be put to death.
Oh, my gosh.
But the angel Gabriel, unseen by everyone else, guided Moses' hand away from the stone and onto the hot coal instead.
Oh, wow.
So Moses burnt his hand, He instinctively put it in his mouth, burning his lips and tongue. And this, the legend says, is why he was later slow of speech and slow of tongue.
Wow. That's a powerful story.
Yeah, it is. It's a really powerful story. And what's so interesting is how the author interprets it, as it relates to this whole self-parenting thing.
Okay, yeah. How do they see it?
So they suggest that guilt, in a way, it acted like that angel for us early in life.
Okay.
So when we were children, if the adults around us, even unintentionally, communicated that certain parts of ourselves, our desires, our feelings, our needs were unacceptable, we developed these internal mechanisms to ensure that we complied.
Okay, so it's like we learn to suppress or hide those parts of ourselves that
Correct.
weren't welcomed or accepted.
Exactly. Because the consequence of not complying was this anxiety of losing connection
Yeah.
with our caregivers,
And the people we depended on.
Exactly. So guilt became one of those mechanisms.
Okay.
Almost like an early warning system.
Right, right.
Steering us away from our own onyx stone, so to speak, which is like our core impulses,
Mhm.
and towards the coal of fire, which is like, whatever those feelings or behaviors were that were deemed acceptable.
Right, the things that wouldn't get us in trouble.
Right, exactly.
So we might have gotten burned in the sense of suppressing parts of ourselves,
Yeah.
but we maintained those essential early relationships.
Exactly. But the thing about guilt, it's not very nuanced, right? It
Right.
basically has one main trigger, which is wanting to do something for yourself that might upset someone else.
Okay.
It doesn't differentiate between a genuine wrongdoing and a healthy act of self-expression.
Right, it just kind of lumps it all together.
Right. To guilt, it's all selfish.
Interesting.
And it also operates outside of time.
Oh, okay.
It doesn't really distinguish between those early relationships and our current adult interactions.
Right.
It can project those old dynamics onto new situations.
Yeah. So even as adults, interacting with our partners or friends or colleagues, that old guilt can still be like running the show
Totally.
as if we're, still trying to avoid upsetting mom and dad.
Exactly. Yeah. Like it hasn't updated its programming to our adult lives.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's still operating on that old software.
Right. And so then our natural reaction a lot of times is to just try to get rid of it.
Yeah.
To obey it, hoping it'll go away.
Right.
But what the author suggests is that we try to see guilt as this well-meaning but perhaps outdated friend.
Okay.
We can acknowledge its warning, don't be selfish. But then we need to use our adult judgment to decide if that warning's still relevant.
Right. So it's about accepting that feeling of guilt
Yes.
without automatically being controlled by it.
Exactly. Yeah. And in fact, the author even suggests that in the initial stages of personal growth, feeling guilty might actually be a good sign.
Oh, that's interesting.
Right.
Why would that be a good sign?
Well, because it could indicate that we're finally starting to acknowledge and move towards our true selves.
Wow, okay.
And that can trigger that guilt response.
So it's like a sign that we're actually starting to break free from those old patterns.
Exactly.
We're starting to prioritize our own needs, and that can bring up some discomfort initially.
Totally, yeah. And the author then brings up the topic of anxiety,
Okay.
and particularly anxiety around self-assertion.
Hmm.
And they use this example of a guy named John,
Okay.
who was a gay man who had spent years prioritizing his partner's desires over his own. And when he finally started to recognize and express his own needs, he started to experience a lot of anxiety.
Oh, that makes sense. So he was kind of stepping outside of his comfort zone.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But what's really interesting is that the author actually views that anxiety as a positive sign.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, because even though it's uncomfortable, it indicates progress. For a long time, John hadn't even allowed himself to consider his own desires.
Right.
So the anxiety that arose when he started to assert himself marked a significant step forward in his journey of self-discovery.
Okay. So sometimes those uncomfortable feelings like anxiety, they're not necessarily something to avoid,
Right.
but rather to acknowledge as signs of growth.
Exactly. Yeah. It can be really hard to sit with those uncomfortable feelings.
Right.
But sometimes they're pointing us in the right direction.
They're showing us where we need to go.
Exactly.
So we've been talking about, self-understanding, self-acceptance, and now this idea of anxiety and guilt as potential indicators of growth.
Yes.
But there's this kind of interesting contradiction that the author brings up,
Okay.
which is that sometimes people with ADD can can act in ways that appear selfish,
Right.
particularly with, things like impulsive behaviors or addictions.
Right.
So how does that fit in with this whole idea of being held back by guilt and anxiety?
Yeah, so it's a great question. And the author explains it like this. The more our true self, our core needs and desires are suppressed, the more likely we are to seek out those quick hits of gratification,
Yeah.
those impulsive behaviors. It's almost like a pressure release valve
Okay.
because we haven't been able to nurture our deeper selves. We might overcompensate
Mhm.
with those more superficial, immediate satisfactions.
So it's almost like a way of trying to meet those needs that
Yes,
aren't being met in a healthy way.
exactly.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And then the author, moves into talking about, being compassionate with ourselves about
Yes.
where we are in our journey.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes, absolutely. This whole idea of self-compassion,
self-compassion. Yeah,
especially about our progress,
yeah,
it's about not punishing ourselves for where we are.
right.
The author talks about this really common feeling of regret that a lot of adults have about wasted time.
Hmm.
Thinking about what they wish they'd known, what they wish they'd done differently years ago.
Right, like if only I had known this back then.
Exactly, exactly. And the author even shares their own experience with these kinds of reflections, which I
Oh,
thought was really powerful. But the core message here is that, we can only make conscious choices when we become aware,
right.
and that awakening is a gradual
Yeah,
process.
it doesn't happen overnight,
No, it doesn't. And we're going to make mistakes along the way.
and that's okay.
And that's okay. It's part of the journey. And the author actually has this beautiful way of reframing that, using a Nietzsche quote.
Oh, okay. What's the quote?
Yeah, so they say, the meaning and value of our blunders is that they show us which path doesn't lead to ourselves.
Wow, I like that.
Right. So even those mistakes, those detours, those wrong turns, they have value because they're showing us what's not working.
Right, they're helping us to course correct.
Exactly.
Yeah, and then finally, the chapter talks about this really important topic of seeking guidance,
Yes.
of getting support, particularly through things like psychotherapy and counseling.
Yes.
Because for many adults who've experienced low self-esteem, emotional pain,
Hmm.
offering themselves that consistent, understanding presence, that essential self-parenting, it can be incredibly challenging to do alone.
Absolutely. And this is where, therapists and counselors can provide such invaluable support,
Yeah.
almost acting as this temporary parent substitute, so to speak,
Okay.
in that they offer that consistent, non-judgmental space to really explore those difficult feelings and develop self-awareness.
Right. So it's like having that secure base
Yes.
that maybe was missing in childhood. Yeah.
Exactly, exactly. And the author kind of makes this point that for a lot of, significant ADD related challenges, professional psychological guidance is often necessary.
Okay.
But it's important to understand what the author sees as the primary goal of therapy.
Okay. Yeah. What is that?
And it's not about, a quick fix or being told what to do, but it's really about facilitating personal growth.
Okay.
It's about becoming more of your own person, developing self-respect.
So it's not about like curing something.
Yeah.
It's about growing and evolving.
Exactly. It's about supporting that journey of self-discovery. And
Yeah.
the therapist kind of acts like this talking mirror,
Oh, I like that.
offering reflections until we develop our own ability to see ourselves more clearly.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the really key aspects of effective therapy is what Carl Rogers called unconditional positive regard, which is that feeling of being completely accepted and supported no matter what you say or do.
Wow. That's so powerful.
It is powerful. And there's this great quote by Anthony Storr
Okay.
who said, "It is only when we no longer feel compelled to judge ourselves, to hide our unavowable thoughts, that we can begin to order our inner world."
Oh, I love that.
Right. So in that environment of unconditional positive regard,
Mhm.
where we can really just be ourselves without fear of judgment,
Right.
it allows those thoughts and feelings to kind of just naturally start to sort themselves out.
Yeah, it creates that safe space for exploration and healing.
Exactly. Yeah. And then the author goes into, some of the practicalities of finding good help,
Okay.
noting that there can be some confusion around, the differences between psychologists and psychiatrists.
Right.
Could you maybe just clarify their roles a bit?
Yeah, sure. So psychologists typically have, really extensive academic training in understanding human behavior, the roots of psychological difficulties, and different therapeutic approaches.
Mm-hmm.
They generally hold doctoral degrees, but they're not medical doctors.
Okay.
So they can't prescribe medication.
Okay.
Psychiatrists, on the other hand, are medical doctors who specialize in mental health.
Mhm.
And their training often have a stronger focus on the biological aspects of mental illness
Okay.
and the use of medication.
Okay. So there's some overlap in what they do, but there are some key differences.
Exactly.
And the author actually expresses some reservations about automatically recommending psychiatrists for most, ADD related issues, except in cases of severe depression or other complex
Oh,
conditions.
interesting. Why is that?
Yeah, so they highlight this concern that psychiatric training has become increasingly focused on this purely biological and pharmacological approach,
Yep.
sometimes overlooking the importance of understanding the individual within their life experiences and relationships.
Yeah. So it's like they're missing that whole person piece.
Exactly. There's this quote in the chapter that I think really illustrates this well.
Okay.
It says, "The past 30 years have witnessed an almost unbelievable explosion of knowledge regarding the biological underpinnings of psychiatric disorders. At the same time, there has been a virtual abandonment of the systematic study of the human organism in context."
Wow.
And then, they go on to say, many medical students learn much about psychopathology, but very little about normal psychology, about the growth and development of the human personality.
Yeah. So it's like they're learning all about what goes wrong,
Mm-hmm.
but not necessarily how things are supposed to go right.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that's a really important foundation to have, right?
It is.
To understand how things are supposed to work
Mm-hmm.
in order to then understand what happens when they don't.
Absolutely. However, the author's quick to emphasize that these are just general trends and
Right.
that there are many skilled and insightful therapists, among both psychiatrists and psychologists, as
Mhm.
well as, professionals from other related fields,
Right.
Ultimately, the most important qualities are things like empathy, integrity, compassion, honesty, insight, and genuine skill
Yeah.
in helping people. And that can come from, people with a variety of different credentials.
So it's really about the person
Yes.
more than the letters after their name.
Exactly.
Yeah. And specifically for adults with ADD, the author points out that it's often not well understood
I make
within
fun.
the mental health field.
Right. It can be really challenging to find someone who really gets it.
Yeah. And while it is beneficial if a therapist has knowledge of ADD, it's even more crucial that they have this deep understanding of human nature
Mm-hmm.
and that they've done their own inner work.
Yes, that's so important. The author even cautions against therapists who haven't addressed their own psychological issues.
Yeah, because that can lead to some pretty unhelpful, even harmful advice.
Exactly.
Right. If they're projecting their own unresolved stuff onto their clients.
Totally. And then the author makes this other really interesting point about family therapy.
Okay.
They see it as potentially very valuable
Mhm.
for individuals with ADD. And even if, the whole family isn't involved in sessions, this family systems approach, it helps individuals to understand their patterns within the context of their family history.
Okay.
And it encourages them to take responsibility for their own feelings, which can be so empowering.
Yeah. Because so often, we can get stuck in that victim role,
Totally.
blaming our families or our past
Right.
for our current struggles.
Yes, and so it's about, recognizing that while those early experiences definitely had an impact, we're not powerless.
Right.
We can choose how we respond.
Yeah, we have agency in the present moment.
Exactly.
So when it comes to actually finding a good therapist,
Yeah.
the author suggests word of mouth referrals
Yeah.
are often the most reliable.
Yeah. Ask friends, family, people you trust.
Exactly.
See if they have any recommendations. And ultimately, it's about how you feel in the presence of that therapist.
Right.
It's so important to trust your instincts,
Mhm.
assess whether you feel truly heard and understood.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And sometimes, those feelings of guilt or anxiety might try to keep us in a
Yes.
therapeutic relationship that isn't actually helpful.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's about tuning into those gut feelings and
Yes.
and being willing to speak up if something's not working.
Mm-hmm. To advocate for
Well,
ourselves.
absolutely.
So to kind of bring it all together, this deep dive into self-parenting, it highlights the importance of starting with this compassionate self-understanding, accepting all of our emotions, even the difficult ones, the guilt, the anxiety, recognizing that.